Good morning, Freedom. I'm going to ask all of our school-age kids to follow Miss Lynn out. It's hard following a video like that. The veterans in the room would like to tell you one thing. This day is not about the veterans. It's about those that didn't come home. And the Gold Star families, we're pretty far away from a large conflict, or we don't have a lot of them anymore, but with the war on terror, we still have some. And so we want to remember and honor those families. My name's John Beck. I'm the associate pastor here, recovery pastor at Freedom. Our senior pastor, Mark Price, and his wife, Jackie, are away on vacation, sailing around the Med, enjoying her, I won't say the number, her birthday. Mark got away with it. I won't do it. I know that look. So Mark called me 6-8 weeks ago, and he asked me to cover for him today. And the day he did that, I was reading from the book of Ruth. So I thought, sure, we're gonna walk through the book of Ruth today. We're gonna walk through the whole book of Ruth today, but you can relax. We're not gonna read the whole thing, and it's only 85 verses anyway. Ruth is, without a doubt, one of the loveliest books in the Bible. In one of the commentaries I read, this is not something for me, I read it from somebody else, but it just really got my attention. The pastor talks about Ruth being like a jeweler breaking out a black velvet cloth and pouring out diamonds and jewels, and letting the brilliance of those jewels just come forward in that black cloth. And the reason is because Ruth is written during the period of Judges. It highlights for us the unconditional love, recovery, and redemption in the way that God builds out of this tragedy. He will build and bring forth a family, a new family, a reborn family that will produce a king, King David. And we're going to hear more about King David's line. A little more background. Ruth and Esther are the only two books in the Bible named for women. It is the only Old Testament book its name comes from a Gentile, and only of two books in the entire Bible, if you count Luke. I'm not going to read the whole thing today, but I suggest if you have it, you go back and read it. It is absolutely literary genius. It's a wonderfully written book, and it's purposeful. It's written during the time of Judges, probably somewhere between chapters 3 and 10. The people of Israel have experienced tremendous famine, starvation, oppression. They've been attacked from many sides. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a little bit of artistic license, and I want to ask you to just join with me at the city gates of Bethlehem. We are standing watching, and we're several cycles in to the Judges' cycles of rebellion, being brought down by God, repentance, and recovery. These cycles have gone on 3 or 4 times, and we're standing in Bethlehem now, and there's at least 2 guys standing there talking. One of them is named Elimelech, and the other one's named Boaz, and they are near kinsmen. They are maybe brothers, half-brothers, at least cousins, and they're talking about Elimelech is going to take a trip, and he's going to go to Moab. And as many of you know, Moab is off limits for the chosen people of God. Lots of bad things have happened there. They've been formed through an incestuous relationship, the people of Moab. But for whatever reason, and we don't know the answer, it doesn't say, Elimelech decides to take his family and go there. This famine that they're in now has created chaos in Judah, and it has produced some desperation. I don't know why, but Elimelech decides to go. And we're going to read from verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and they lived there. This entire book speaks to the need that we have for an obedience to God and his covenants. We don't need to really look at any of the individuals in it. The overall story, the overall setting for the story speaks to the need for obedience. So the first thing we're doing is we're looking at the period of time. It's a period of time when there's absolute disobedience from God by the Israelites. And there is a price to pay for that. These cycles of sin, judgment, and sorrow, repentance and favor repeatedly, over and over again. Elimelech has been criticized throughout history, throughout the biblical history, for leaving and taking his family to Moab. This is done by scholars, the Jewish scholars and our scholars, our theologians. And there's good reason for it. There is writing in Deuteronomy and back in the Bible which tells why you shouldn't do this. But the author does not state an opinion. He just says Elimelech goes. And as we read on, we learn that he dies. Elimelech gets to Moab with his wife and 2 sons, and he dies. And his 2 sons have married. Mahlon married Ruth, and Chilion married Orpah. And you would think, aha, they married two pagans. And then the 2 sons die. So there seems to be a pattern of God acting out against them leaving. This must be the result of disobedience. But what we know is this. The first chapter of Ruth is heartbreaking. We've got the first chapter of Ruth, and we've got a background of some low, solemn music, and we're just waiting. We're waiting for that moment where the tempo is going to pick up. We haven't heard God's name mentioned yet. And this story, which will ultimately end with redemption and recovery, is set where we're at now in this horrible backdrop of pain and suffering. During a period of rebellion against God and civil authority, what would you expect? The people believe themselves to be of a free will. They've been landed in the promised land. They've been given property. The people of Israel have been given property and ownership, and they developed this independence mindset. They've got a mindset of self-determination. I don't need anyone else. I don't need anyone else telling me what to do or how to live my life. I don't need a ruler. I don't need a leader. From the final verses in Judges, we read what the mindset really is. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. I think in modern times we call the word anarchy. And as we began reading on in Ruth, as this one man has chosen to sojourn. So sojourn, struggling with that word, what it means is a temporary trip. He did not go to Moab meaning to settle there permanently. It was supposed to be temporary. But I'm going to highlight 2 points about the criticism of Elimelech and Israel during the time of Judges. Number 1, God's gift of the promised land came with conditions. First, God required that Israel, the nation and the people, had to trust and obey him. So with this promise came conditions. Second, God demanded faithful worship of him And this is from Deuteronomy 7. To God, idolatry was such a serious offense that he threatened to throw people out of the land if they worshiped other gods. Today, we probably want to carry on not just gods, these idols, these statues that they did in their day. There are other idols that we can worship today that look the same. Regardless of what's going on around us, famine, oppression, political unrest, during these times where it seems like the world is just coming apart, God continues to show favor. And God continues to show that he has not and he will not abandon us. Ruth is a book about the faithful, the imperfect people of God's family struggling to survive in the midst of a time like Judges, and Ruth during Judges. When things look hard, when things look like, woe is me. Look. God wants us to look now and see. And then this point is a great point, great time to segue and bring Ruth into picture. So, coming forward, we're at a point now where Elimelech is gone. His 2 sons have married pagan women. His 2 sons have died. Naomi, Elimelech's wife, is left in Moab with 2 daughter-in-laws. And at this moment, she had decided to stay. But apparently Naomi has received an email or a text. And somebody has told her the famine is over. The barley harvest is looking wonderful. The fields are full. Come home. Come home for everything that happens in Israel has a feast that goes along with it. Well, they're going to have a feast. They're going to have the harvest celebration. And these 3 ladies are working their way back to Judah. They've left Moab. They're working their way back. And it's a pretty good trip. I don't know if it's 2 weeks or a month, but it's going to take a little bit of time. They're going to be out in the wilderness, making their way back home. And Naomi's got a lot of time to think. And what she begins to think about is what's going to happen when she brings her daughter-in-laws back with her. And as we read this story, we find that these 3 ladies have developed a relationship and a bond with each other. It's really special. And Naomi begins to consider this may not be such a good idea. It may not be such a good idea taking these daughters that I love back to Judah. Almost as if she's saying, I love my people, but I'm not sure how my people are going to love these 2. And she's assumed they will not be accepted. And she knows in the back of her mind that these 2 ladies, back in this time, if you're a widow, you need to either have a family to help you, or you need to have youth, or you need to have the prospect of remarrying. And a good, proper Jew is not going to marry a Moabite. It's not going to happen. Naomi knows this. And she explains this to him. Orpah sees the wisdom, and she decides to go back to her family. Something magical has happened in Ruth. I'm just going to read it. When Naomi begins to tell the 2 to go back home, here is what Ruth's reply is. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord, there it is the first time, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Apparently, Elimelech's family, Naomi, had been evangelizing to the two ladies. They knew about the goodness, the faithfulness. They knew about godly living. We see this demonstrated in Ruth's heart. We've heard this before in weddings, probably, many of us. It's sweet. This is the Hazan. This is the Hebrew version of a Greek word we know, agape. That is a love that happens not by sight, not by just feeling someone, a tenderness to someone. This is a choice. You are going to look at someone and you are going to choose to love them. We don't have the ability to love like that on our own. It requires something bigger. So, Naomi tried to warn Ruth, but Ruth was determined. Ruth had a power working within her. Ruth is responding to something going on within her that it's an obedience to a law and a command that in her immature, where she's at in faith is so immature, she doesn't grasp it or know it. She doesn't understand it. But these are the traits that God endeavors to build in all of us. That's what he's trying to transform us into. That's why he shares stories like this with us. We can find a love like this described in Mark 12. Christ speaks of this in the flesh. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Finally, in the closing text of chapter 1, despite what we see in Naomi, we get a really good picture of where the rest of her heart is in the close of chapter 1. As Ruth and Naomi finally enter Bethlehem, they're back at those city gates we started at. City gates, everything happens there. That's where the community meets and talks and makes community decisions. And as Ruth and Naomi walk up, somebody looks and says, "Could that be Naomi?" And this is a friendly greeting. It's Naomi means friendship, friendly. And she says, "Don't call me Naomi." She told them, "Call me Mara, because the Lord Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." That's Ruth 1, verses 20 through 22. This is the same mindset that we read from Job chapter 27 when he says, verse 2, "As surely as God lives, who has denied me justice, the Almighty who has made my life bitter." In God's sovereignty and the providence, we see that even living under the blessing and covering of God, things aren't always great. There's going to be hard times. And we're just gonna root Naomi on. Just keep going, Ruth. We're going to turn the page here in a minute. But I'm going to tell you this. What do you make out of Naomi's theology? How Naomi talks about her condition and how she sees herself in relation to God. Personally, I'll take it. I will take someone who speaks honestly from the heart about what's going on in their life, even if that person wants to blame God. I would rather have honesty than some super hyper spiritual view of God that tells somebody you shouldn't feel that way. For us to work together as a community of faith, we've got to be honest with one another. We've got to know exactly where we stand. As a pastor who shepherds a ministry of the broken people in recovery, I see a lot of hope in this, because whenever someone is honest with you, you know what you have to work on. You know where you stand. One thing about Naomi, even though there's a bitterness and a brokenness in what she says, what you hear is this. You hear her say that God exists, that God is sovereign, and that it was God that afflicted her. She's looking in the right way. She's looking in the right direction. And while she's crying out to God about what she feels has been done to her, these cries will turn to cries of restoration and redemption. And God is faithful. I'm just glad that what we see is amidst the pain, she sees that God is sovereign. This was our point on obedience, and where obedience to God takes us in both directions. When we're obedient and we're not obedient. But it also teaches us another thing. I apologize, we don't have handouts or bulletins. Yesterday, the enemy decided that he was going to just create mischief with our service, mechanically and printing. But in Jesus' name, he has been bound, and he will not stop us. We have swords. We have the ability to carry on with our service. In Jesus' name. So, it's nice the way this book is laid out. Chapter 1, you get many points. I chose obedience. Chapter 2 is a little different. The music changed. It's going to get a little bit happier. And the one thing that really came to mind for me was how it teaches us to make a very intentional consideration of poor and vulnerable peoples. The way God overcomes, from my viewpoint, these barriers is through the fruitfulness of other peoples. We are God's hand and feet. We are the easiest way for him to be able to serve and to help poor people, broken people, vulnerable people. And that's not just one or two or three people in this room, it's all of us. We're all called to be a part of that. We see this in Ruth, and we go back in the Old Testament, the laws that God put in place for societies and the guidance that he gives individuals to live it out. We're all witnesses to how God's law calls people of means. Everyone sitting in this room, based on our comparison of the entire globe, we are people of means. We drove here. I won't even go to all the ways. Our word for the day is thankful. My goodness. Just stop for a minute and think about everything that we have to be thankful for. We could talk the rest of the day about it. So Ruth, we're going to flip over to chapter 2, and we're going to just jump down to verse 17. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. You know what? Let's go back and look at something about poor people. I lost some of my notes and I almost left something out. Let's jump up to verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." I didn't catch this really hard until yesterday. So these two ladies have traveled back to Bethlehem. They are war slam out. They are tired. They wake up, and Ruth, who is a stranger in Bethlehem, she's probably somewhere on a hillside. She's looking down into the valley, and there's fields and vineyards everywhere. It's beautiful. It's the time of harvest. I would imagine she might be overwhelmed. They've got nothing. They've got no food. So Ruth looks to her mother-in-law Naomi and said, I'm going to go out in the fields, and I am going to see if I can pick up leftover grain. So we're speaking of poor people and vulnerable people, but the one thing that we want to notice here is that Ruth did not wake up and say, woe is me, pity me, poor me. She didn't do any of that. She said, Mom, I'm going to get up and go to work. I'm going to go work and find us some food. So now we'll jump back down to 17. I just thought, that is a wonderful model right there. So Ruth gleaned, back to 17, so Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. She worked all day. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered after she worked all day, and it amounted to an ephah. I don't know how much an ephah is, but it's probably a big old bag. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered, and Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over from lunch. We'll go back through that. Her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. The name of the man I work with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead, she added. That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until you have finished harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because if someone else failed, you might be harmed. You'll be protected. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat fields were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So the first thing we notice is the change in Naomi's demeanor. Naomi is suddenly aware of what is happening. What is happening? God is obviously at work. Naomi sees it. Her entire attitude has changed and turned around. The opportunity that these two find it's around the gleaning. Gleaning is one of those elements of law that I spoke of. It helps protect the poor and the vulnerable. And I'm not going to go into all of it, reading all of the Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Exodus, but essentially what we're talking about is when you reap the harvest of your land, you can't reap out to the very edges. And then whatever you drop as you're reaping, you can't go back and pick that up. You leave that for poor people. And you don't strip your vineyards bare. You leave a little bit. And when you drop the grapes, you don't go back and pick up what you've dropped. You leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. What we do when we do this for the poor, we do this in consideration with our relationship with God. When you reap your harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf in the field, don't go back and get it. You leave it. You leave it for the aliens. You leave it for the orphans. You leave it for the widows. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th year you let it rest and lie in fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild animals may eat. You shall do the same with your vineyard and with your orchards. Exodus 23. God is telling you about his mind, how his mind is centered around us and poor people and orphans and the vulnerable and the needy. The basis of the law is an intentional that God, through God's people, creates a mechanism of production that helps all people to support themselves and one another and their families and their communities. We all have a vital role and responsibility in this. In general, in the time, every family was to have a perpetual allotment of land, and the land that could never be alienated. And God set up things that were very specific, for the chosen people, the people that were not chosen, that were aliens in the land. God thought about them too. He didn't leave them out. The priests, they had their way. Everything was well thought. These passages that we can read about the gleaning laws, about how God wants to demonstrate his generosity through us, it kind of points to three things. Number one, there's a prerequisite for God's blessing by the work of the people's hands. We got to kind of work that around in our head, but it speaks to how we can expect to find God's blessing. In it, there's also an idea that is driven by the memory of Israel's experience under cruel and abusive slave masters. There is a mindset of those that will take advantage of anyone and will hoard, who will make themselves rich, who will make themselves absolutely horrendous by the idea of more. I need more. I don't have enough to share. That is not God's way of thinking. That is not a way of thinking that God wants us to have. And then finally, this third point is this. The forms of charity that God's talking about are not something that we should, from time to time, think about as a way to make ourselves feel good. It's obedience. It is us living the will of God. When we read previously from verse 17 on, we saw all three of these motivations in Boaz's actions. We were speaking of Ruth, but we saw Boaz at work. Number one, Boaz blessed Ruth. When he spoke to her, may God bless you. Before he did anything else, he remembered God's graciousness to Israel, and from that reading, what we grasp is that Boaz's manner and what Boaz doesn't do to draw attention to Boaz. What Boaz does, he does to create a praise for God. This is for God. I do this for the glory of God. And then he commended Ruth for placing herself in God's hands. Boaz looks at Ruth, someone who's young in faith, and he commends her. The trust and the faith that he sees in her, Boaz looks, as we do, as we try to, is to look at someone's feet, not listen to their mouth. Boaz is the kind of example that makes us ask ourselves, thankfulness? How do we display to the people that see us operate in our daily lives how grateful we are? Do we look like grateful people? Do we look like people that we are going to give back all that God pours into us and gives to us? What kind of stewards are we with what God has assigned us? It's about the poor and the vulnerable. There's another aspect of this. It's about those people who are frequently exploited and mistreated. Ruth was in a very difficult situation. She would have been in a difficult situation at home in those ancient times. A young widow. She was in an especially bad place in Judah, a place where most despised Moabites. Desperate single women living in a time of lawlessness had few options when it came to work. We know what those options are. In those dark ages, especially they weren't educated, they didn't have any kind of way to engage in commerce. Somehow or another, they were going to be regulated to a form of servitude or perhaps prostitution. This is one of the key lessons we learn as a church in Providence, that there are some painful things. And throughout these painful things, we need courageous people to stand up. And the book of Ruth reminds the church, especially us men, those of us who call ourselves godly men, that there are opportunities for us to alter, to take action that which could possibly alter the life of people at risk, people who are being exploited. And we're not going to make this sermon about that today, but we want to make that a thought for each of us. Lately, in the past 6 months, we've heard of a number of things that we've been talking about around this church. There are many things that men, young and old, can learn about being a man from the model that was demonstrated by Boaz. And we can observe that he was a godly man in practically all aspects of his everyday life. And reading chapter 2, you can almost follow Boaz around for one whole day. And you can see what he looks like. You could see his feet. It's not Boaz telling you what kind of man he is. It's us looking, and we can watch him operating with the people he works with and 2 widows, and we can see what kind of man he is. The first thing we notice is, look at verse 4 in chapter 2. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, and he greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. Go to a construction site anywhere around here and let the foreman walk on. You think you'd hear something like that? I doubt it. The Lord be with you. And this is not probably something that happened because Boaz sent somebody who was watching. The workers responded back, the Lord bless you. This is something that seems to be the way they operate. This seems to be, as a leader, we have a responsibility to set the tone. And this is the tone that Boaz has set with the people that work for him. So, given this little bit of narrative context, the implication is that Boaz has good testimony with his workers. I'm going to hire you to work here with me, and I'm going to pay you fairly, but I want to let you know, this place is covered by God, and we're going to honor God, and we're not going to disrespect God in my workplace. Boaz seems to have laid that out. And their cheerfulness from the workers, they're bought into it. So, in this immediate example, the context of Boaz's work life is that he has created one of godliness. The next thing is Boaz's conversation with Ruth. Verse 12. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Man, what a lesson for us men. I want to be that kind of man. I'm not talking about in an odd way, the hyper, super spiritual way, but a walk and talk way. Something that's attainable, something that can look earnest and real. I'm not talking about walking around with some 16th century prayer mumbo jumbo, just trying to sound and look like a godly man. I want people to be comfortable around me and know that I have faith in God. I want people to be comfortable around me and know that I'm trying to live knowing that God is always there. He's always there. His presence is always there. And I'm going to keep that in mind. Speaking to the women, the number one thing that needs to be on your checklist is looking for a man like this. Looking for a man that's going to treat you the way you deserve to be treated. Who's going to treat you like you both know that God is always looking. And if God's name does not come forth from his mouth, he is not present in his heart. This needs to be on the checklist for the type of man that you're going to spend the rest of your life with. Then much as now, wealth meant power. Boaz, he served Ruth, he provided for Ruth, and he protected Ruth. He was there to make sure that no one interfered with her, harassed her, or embarrassed her. She is an immigrant. She came into Judah as an immigrant. She dressed different. She talked different. She didn't have any money. She was a target. Boaz stepped up. Verse 14 says, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. And as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So as we read on, Boaz, early on in his relationship with Ruth, he exemplified all these qualities. He provided for her at mealtime. He commanded the young men not to reproach her, and he sought. He tried to ensure that there was a level of dignity created and left with everybody around her. Yeah, we're going to drop some stuff, but we're not going to do it in a way that makes her feel bad. And we want to memorialize the character of Boaz. These characteristics that he shows. He's courteous, he's generous, he shows valor. From a biblical standpoint, what the Lord is trying to teach us is this kind of behavior matters. The mindset of the time was self-determination, that it's just me and mine. That's all that matters. I got to take care of my people. I got to protect my property. And God says, no, we've got to be more than that. We've got to be more than that, not only with our family, but with everyone around us. We've got to be courteous. We've got to be generous. We've got to be noble. We've got to be godly in our workplaces. And I've got to be that way with everyone. And the last point is this, is about his leadership. He wasn't a tyrant to his workers. He wasn't afraid to give orders. He wasn't afraid to do his job and tell his workers what to do. But he didn't do it in a dictatorial way. He did it in a fatherly, loving way. He gave them directions, but he did it respectfully. Boaz was a role model. In every aspect of his life, he was a role model. So I don't remember when or where, but I heard a talk on this before. And what that pastor said was, Boaz demonstrates courageous leadership. This is the kind of leadership that requires prayer. It requires us to contemplate what we're going to say and do before we do it. And it requires us to make sometimes difficult decisions. Boaz was not going to take to the barn as much grain or wheat as he could have taken. We know that. But he thought things through, and he did the right thing. The next point I want to make is the preacher's point. This is the point that you got to make in Ruth because it's so evident. And you all know what it's going to be. It's about Jesus. It's about a Redeemer. It's about God working through the Old Testament, all these ways where he's pushing forth this idea of the Messiah. And I want to make sure that nobody reads the rest of this and misses that. The whole reason for walking in that door for every one of us was to hear that one point, to believe that one point. So in our story here, it's around midnight. We're on the threshing floor. They've all come in. The workers have done their bit, and they've got their grain in a pile. And back then, what you had to do was gather your grain, pile it up, and then all the workers would sleep around it. Because if you didn't, you know what happened? People would come in the night and steal it. So Boaz is laying down. The temperature drops. He shivers a little bit, and he rolls over. And he discovers there's a woman laying at his feet. So what does Boaz do? He asks the question, who are you? We got to turn to chapter 3 to find the answer to that question. Who is this woman lying at Boaz's feet? It's really one of the most, it's one of the best conversations, not only in Ruth, but in the Bible. When Ruth asked to be covered, I guess we need to read a little bit. You don't know what I'm talking about. We're going to go to Ruth 3:9. Who are you, he asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, which are whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. So when Ruth asked to be covered, she's bringing forth an idea that is grounded in Levirate law. This idea that we hear here, guardian redeemer. And it's about when there is a death in these Jewish families, the next brother will marry the widow and keep the family line going. There's a lot of lines and its and legal mumbo jumbo to it. We'll have to get Ken to explain all of it to us, but anyway, she's bringing the idea forward. And the idea is to rescue this family, to redeem this family. And what we have left is two widows. It's a request that's made in humility and faith. She's making the request to Boaz, but the overwhelming idea and feeling we get from it is through Boaz to God, she is asking for redemption. This request and Boaz's response is a party to how God sets the stage for the redemption of all mankind, because as these two come together, we'll read on. Boaz responds in a way that answers his own prayers for Ruth's protection. We've already heard him pray for her protection. We reference back to verse 12. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. God is working through the actions of a righteous man to accomplish his plans for a faithful widow. Faithful man, faithful widow come together. The book of Ruth shows how divine providence and human ingenuity often work together in redemptive history. There's a lot of dramatic twists to this, but in the end, Boaz gets the girl. During this tender exchange, Boaz calls Ruth her daughter and uses a common Hebrew formula that is designed to put her mind at ease. He says in verse 11, "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do all for you that you ask. And all the people of my town know that you are a noble woman of character. Do not fear." The last time I preached, this is the same thing that Christ told the three right after they witnessed the transformation of Christ. Boaz knows Ruth is a virtuous woman and someone will redeem her. She's apparently a very good-looking woman. She's young. She's of marrying age. It's the whole setting and the whole writing, the way the author done this, it's just a gorgeous language. I'm typically someone that reads Clancy or Civil War history. This is not my genre, but this is really good. It's better than Baldwin or Steinbeck. The scene ends with Boaz telling Ruth, this widow, not to be afraid, and she's not. She relaxes. She rests her head at his feet. It's the image of hope personified that we want to find in a story like this. This tells us why we need to study a book like Ruth. It allows us to see God's display of redemption and the adoption that we have in Christ. This is where our pastor continues to tell us to read a little, be quiet a lot. When you read a little and you be quiet a lot, you can hear God speak these things to you through what you read here. For the longest time, I was scared of the Old Testament. I thought, what is this? What is this doing for me? And then back when I finally realized what God was trying to do to just show images of Jesus coming forward in the Old Testament, that what you read in the New Testament is revealed. And then finally, my last point is this. We're doing okay. Ruth demonstrates that God accomplished his sovereign will through his providence. I don't believe there are any miracles in the book of Ruth. There's one that's questionable. Well, I'll throw it out there in a little while and ask you. What is providence? So Mark, our pastor, I've heard him a lot, Mark, our senior pastor, he refers to this systematic theology from Gruden. So I got one. And it says that providence summarizes God's ongoing relationship with his creation. He breaks it down as God preserves, he controls or concurs, one or the other, and he governs his creation. So what that little bit of there said was, God does not take the world and us in it and wind it up and set it down and let it just run around in circles. He's involved. He's at work. He's not allowing us to bounce around the bumpers like we're in some universal pinball machine. God can do miracles. I believe I witnessed a miracle last week when Isaiah preached at the end. We talked about that in small group. So it's not a Coke machine. We can't drop a quarter in and make a miracle come out. It's not the way it works. But we can know one thing. He's at work at all times in the world that we live in and operate in our individual world. No matter what's going on in our lives, God is at work. Ruth's story may have a little bit of inspiration to Paul in Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. We've heard this idea regarding faith before. Do we really grasp its meaning from within the provident power of God? Do we really grasp what that means to us and for us? And so I paused yesterday to read a little more on that, just to make sure that I didn't get up here and get on dicey ground. And I found what I agreed with. And I found what I think that many here will agree with. In God's provident power over our lives, the one truth that we know for sure is God is sovereign. God the Almighty reigns in all affairs of man and mankind. There is no other power, there is no other influence but his. He rules the nations, Daniel 2:21, and he rules families. We read this in Ruth 4. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive. Keep that in mind, this may be our miracle. And she gave birth to a son. The woman said, Naomi, praise be the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. God is sovereign. 2, God's providence is mysterious. It's often very hard to comprehend. God had dealt, or appeared to have dealt, bitterly with Naomi. I know for her, in the short run, it felt like bitterness. And perhaps we can say that it was all owing to the sin of going to Moab and allowing her sons to marry foreign wives. But I can tell you one thing, there's not a parent in here that chose their child's spouse. It's not the way it works. And we'll not make any comments beyond that. Psalm 34:19 says, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." Neither the Old Testament nor the New Testament promises any believer that they will escape the affliction that comes after life. We're going to all die. Elimelech and both of his sons were ultimately going to die, and we're going to all ultimately pass from this life. No child of God's going to escape that. But what matters is this. It's not when or how we die. It's how we live. That's what really matters. God's purpose, number 3, is for our good. Not only does God reign in all the affairs of men, and not only is his providence sometimes hard, but in all the works, in all of his purposes, is for the good of us, of mankind. Even if the least of all that he does in goodness in our salvation, it is that one thing that is worth all that we endure in faith in God. Who would have imagined that in the worst of all the times, that period of Judges, when God was quietly moving in the tragedies of one single family to prepare the way for the greatest king of Israel, through all of that, to advent in, to use his providence to bring people together in the perfect way to make this one marriage and this one birth. And everyone that I read thinks that Ruth was barren and that the birth was a miracle. So there's a miracle in Ruth that it doesn't say. Regardless, we find great joy. And we don't have any idea why Elimelech departed Judah except for one thing. It was to serve God's purpose. And we know that all these things work together. And all these people work together. Elimelech and his sons, Naomi, Ruth, Boaz, all are called according to his purpose. We consider the providence of God, and we have to consider that these good things that he does, and that God will use sin and evil for good purposes. Sometimes in God's sovereignty, he decides these things are necessary. And we leave all those decisions to him. But in the end, there's always going to be this sweet expression of grace. Wait, hang on, wait for God's mercy and grace. It's coming. In Ruth, there is a message, there's a tremendous message of hope for strong and hurting families. Today's a Memorial Day. Today typically is the day that we stand in remembrance of those who have fallen. And a book like this gives hurting families that light of hope. And I'm going to say it again. This is different from what I usually read. It's a beautiful story of how God's involved in our everyday lives. The writer was very careful not to speak like he was speaking for God. Doesn't use a third person implication. It's not characteristics of people who wrote back then. But we can see God's touch throughout every move. And the powerful piece of the larger story of God's redemption for all of us Through Naomi the widow, she has the tragic story of death, and she renamed herself bitter, but through it God was working. And Ruth the Moabite, she gives up on the life in her native land, and in a gesture of loyalty, she follows Naomi. And through this, through her risk, God is working. And Boaz, he didn't have to pay attention to anyone. He could have just continued to reap that harvest that he had in all of his fields. But he listened to God, and God was working. The conclusion of this book is in a genealogy. The conclusion of Ruth is in a genealogy. And most of the time, I tell you what, I just remembered how I got to Ruth. I was looking at Matthew and genealogy, and I realized how I always skip over it. And I went back and I read it, and I read it close, and I saw a couple of names, and I go, wait a minute, Matthew is a Jew, and he's writing women's names in here, and it caused me to go on a rabbit trail, and I found myself in Ruth. And we have a similar genealogy here in Ruth. This verse 18, chapter 4, this then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. So we dig a little to the family tree here. We see that because Naomi was widowed, and because Ruth was bold, and because Boaz was noble, God is intricately woven through every detail of their lives and hints in our lives. God's here. God's there. David was born, and from the lineage of them comes the Messiah, comes our Lord Jesus. And I don't know what else to say beyond that. That is such a great place to close at. I hope that, I'm sorry we didn't have a handout. I hope that in some time in the near future, you'll go back and read Ruth, and there's a lot more to the book. What we're going to do now is we're going to ask Tony to come up, and we're going to have a few moments that our leaders are going to come forward, and we will have a response time. I got to tell you one more thing. I got caught in the middle of the service. This is not something that happened as a result of Boaz. It happened as a result of my conversion. Most of you know I'm in the recovery ministry in this church. And 3 years after I got sober, I met Mark. And 2 or 3 years. And as a result, a profession of faith happened. And I've been reading Boaz, and today I was standing looking on this stage, and there was a 17-year-old up here who was introduced into my life when I was converted. And over the years, I had not been the best father or husband. I drank a lot, and I did not live this type of life. A little baby girl was brought into our house. And that period of time, I made a decision. She is not going to see from me the things my kids saw. What I want to show her is throughout her life, an idea of unconditional love, and that there's going to be a man there for her entire life, that she's going to be able to count on. And I've worked, and Sally and I have worked to show her that. And I am so glad that my little niece came to join us for the ceremony today. And I'm proud of all you graduates. And just want to, one more time, give a hand to all the hard work they've done. Now, before I start bawling, I need some leaders to come forward, and we're going to have a moment of response.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. I surely hope that what you heard was relevant and helpful, and above everything, I hope that what you experienced today really helped your heart to connect with the heart of God. Now, if what you heard for you stirred up any questions or maybe led you toward some type of spiritual decision, maybe you want to talk with someone about something that's on your mind, I would love to hear from you. And so I would encourage you, reach out by email. At the bottom of the screen, you see my email address. It's mark@myfreedomchurch.net. That's not going to go to a secretary or an assistant. That'll come directly to me. I'd love to hear from you and talk with you about anything that's on your mind. And if in the future you're in our area, we would love for you to come and worship with us at Freedom Church. But until then, we invite you to access all of the sermon material that you find online. Again, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. Hope that you have a great day.